Welcome to Night Lesson. Relax and learn along the way.
Intro: The Great Library of Alexandria. Imagine, for a moment, there was a place where all the knowledge of the known world was gathered under a single vast roof. A place that did not just preserve carefully labeled scrolls on endless shelves, but where the brightest minds of their time pushed the boundaries of thought, mapped the stars in the night sky, and measured the earth with astonishing precision. Such a place once existed, radiant and majestic in its intellectual pull, the Great Library of Alexandria. Yet, like a single candle flame in the wind, this point of light of knowledge burned out over the centuries, and with it disappeared a treasure of wisdom whose invaluable worth we can hardly measure today. This center of the mind was far more than just a silent warehouse for papyrus. It was a pulsing living organism of research, a true think tank of antiquity, populated by scholars, poets, and scientists. It symbolized the deep human urge not just to inhabit the world, but to understand it, to catalog it, and to coax from it its hidden secrets. To grasp this place, we must immerse ourselves in the Hellenistic age. It was an epoch that followed the conquests of Alexander the Great, during which his namesake city on the Nile Delta became a melting pot of cultures. Greek, Egyptian, and Persian influences met here and ignited an unprecedented intellectual hunger. Accompany me now on a quiet journey to the origins of this legendary institution. We wander through the halls of its most glorious years and gently approach the mysterious circumstances that led to its gradual disappearance. In doing so, we will not only collect facts and names, but also reflect on the fragile nature of knowledge and its transience. Let us glide together through the centuries and feel the silence that this lost treasure has left behind. Simply lean back, breathe in deeply and calmly, and allow the images of the past to arise slowly and peacefully before your inner eye. Chapter 1: Birth of a Vision. Let us begin our journey in a time more than 2,000 years ago, where the glowing sun of the Mediterranean illuminated a new era of thought and the pursuit of knowledge. In the 4th century before our era, a vision unfolded on the North African coast that would change the face of the ancient world forever. It was the vision of one man, Alexander the Great, whose gaze reached across the salty spray of the sea into the distance as he laid the foundation stone for a city that would bear his name and become the cradle of incomparable intellectual achievements. Alexandria, a young conqueror, driven by an irrepressible will and a sense of the strategic importance of the location, formed not just a military fortress at this spot, but a cosmopolitan hub intended to unite the cultures of the East and West. He dreamed of a harbor that would attract the riches of the world, and of an urban center that would expand the horizon of human understanding. But as so often in the grand design of things, the realization of this profound idea was left to others. After Alexander's all-too-early death, which held the world in suspense and plunged his vast empire into a power vacuum, the empire he had forged disintegrated among his generals, the Diadochi. From this bitter struggle for succession, a new dynasty arose in Egypt, the Ptolemies. At its head stood Ptolemy I, Soter the Savior, as history would call him, once a close companion of Alexander and now ruler over the rich land of the Nile. He was a general of sharp intellect who saw more than just military superiority or territorial gain. Ptolemy I recognized that the true power of his newly founded dynasty lay not in the weapons of his soldiers alone, but in something far more enduring and influential: knowledge itself. He harbored the bold dream of shaping Alexandria into an intellectual center that would outshine all other metropolises of the Hellenistic world. Such an institution was intended not only to legitimize his claim to rule, but also to anchor the splendor of his dynasty in the annals of history. In this decisive phase of his work, he met a man whose intellectual depth and visionary power would lay the foundation for the greatest library of antiquity. Demetrius of Phaleron, this Athenian statesman and philosopher, once a regent of his home city himself, had been driven into exile after a change of power in Athens and found a new home and an open-minded patron in Alexandria. Demetrius was not just a thinker, but also a practitioner of knowledge. He carried within him the living memory of the great places of learning in Athens. the academies, and the peripatoi, where scholars explored the world under the watchful eyes of the Muses. With these models in mind, he inspired Ptolemy I to found a sanctuary of the Muses, the so-called Museum. Yet this museum was far more than just a library in the modern sense. It was a comprehensive research and teaching institution, a living organism of the mind dedicated to the 9 Muses. Here, scholars from all corners of the known world were to find a home, provided with apartments, spacious dining halls that invited exchange and debate, and even observatories to decode the secrets of the heavens. The founding of the Library of Alexandria, around 280 BC, at the beginning of the flourishing Ptolemaic dynasty, was an act of strategic brilliance. It was not the accidental result of a whim, but a targeted political decision to establish Alexandria as the undisputed intellectual capital of the entire Hellenistic world. Demetrius of Phaleron was the driving force, the visionary, who pushed the conception of this institution as a universal storehouse of knowledge. He imagined a collection that would encompass every conceivable piece of writing, a place where all human knowledge was gathered, studied, and preserved. In the minds of these men, the ambitious idea of a cultural lighthouse was born, whose light continues to shine in our imagination today, telling us of the incomparable hope for unlimited understanding. Chapter 2: The Magnificent Building and its System. The vision of an unlimited storehouse of knowledge, which had taken shape in the minds of those ancient scholars, eventually manifested in an architectural splendor that was second to none. Let us imagine standing in Alexandria on a sun-drenched morning, the salty scent of the sea still in the air, mixed with the aroma of far-off spices that enliven the busy harbor streets. Before us rises, majestic and sublime, the complex of the Museum, that site of the Muses which was to become the pulsing heart of intellectual life. Its facade, carved from radiant white marble, catches the light of the Egyptian sky, and lets it dance in soft reflections, a sight that evokes admiration and awe in equal measure. This museum was far more than just a simple library. It was a comprehensive academy, a forward-looking research institute designed to attract and house the most brilliant minds of the ancient world. Here, scholars found not only the means for their studies, but also accommodation, dining halls, and above all, an inspiring community. At the center of this magnificent structure lay the main hall of the library, a place of impressive size and careful design. High ceilings allowed the room to breathe, rows of columns structured the interior, and the muted light falling through artistic openings gave everything an aura of solemn silence. Patient reading rooms branched off from this central hall, equipped with comfortable benches and tables where the soft rustle of papyrus rolls was the only sound that broke the concentration of the students. Beside them were lecture halls where philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers shared their knowledge, as well as wide green gardens that invited reflection and intellectual exchange under the open sky. In fact, the Library of Alexandria consisted of 2 main parts. The Mother Library, the great main collection, was located within this museum in the royal quarter of the city. Its function was to collect, preserve, and make available to scholars all reachable knowledge. But there was also a smaller yet no less significant daughter library, housed in the Serapeum, an imposing temple district dedicated to the god Serapeum. This daughter library served as a supplement to the main collection, possibly as a more publicly accessible lending library, or as an archive for duplicates and older writings to relieve the main library. The 2 institutions formed a coherent system aimed at making knowledge broadly accessible while simultaneously keeping the most precious works safe. The construction and materials reflected the ambition of this undertaking. Beside the omnipresent marble for structure and representation, wood played a decisive role in the interior furnishings. Shelves, cabinets, and tables specifically made for the storage of sensitive papyrus rolls. Papyrus, made from the plant of the same name, was the primary medium of information at that time. These rolls, written by hand and elaborately produced, were however extremely susceptible to moisture, pests, and the passage of time. Therefore their storage required the highest care. Often they were kept in specially made compartments or boxes, the so-called armoria, which offered not only protection but also allowed for a systematic arrangement. The sheer volume of the scrolls, It is estimated that at its height the library contained up to 700,000 rolls, presented those in charge with a monumental challenge of order. How was this unmanageable sea of knowledge to be catalogued and made accessible to scholars? Here, the true genius of the Alexandrian scholars reveals itself as they developed the earliest known library system in the world. The driving force behind this revolutionary organization was Callimachus of Cyrene, a poet and scholar who lived around 310 to 240 BC. He created the famous Pinax, a monumental work that recorded all the scrolls present in the library in 120 volumes. This comprehensive catalog was more than just a list. It organized the works by genre: poetry, prose, history, philosophy, and within these categories by author. Each entry contained biographical information about the author and a brief summary of the work. The Pinax are not only a testament to incredible intellectual achievement, but are also considered one of the first comprehensive bibliographic works in history, laying the foundation for modern cataloging systems. They enabled scholars to find their way through this vast collection of knowledge, to find specific works, and to study cross-references that deepened their research. This system of order, embedded in the silent dignity of the reading rooms and the sublime architecture of the museum, created an atmosphere of deep scholarship. The tireless work on the collection and its structuring bears witness to a profound respect for the written word and the unconditional will to preserve the knowledge of humanity for coming generations. The soft whispering of students, the subtle tapping of styluses on wax tablets, and the occasional turning of a papyrus roll were the sounds of a world dedicated to understanding, a world that, in its systematic recording of knowledge, had embarked on an adventure whose scale continues to captivate our imagination to this day. Chapter 3: The Knowledge Hunters. From this deep devotion to knowledge, a policy of collection grew in Alexandria that was unprecedented in its consistency and ambition. The Ptolemaic rulers, driven by the desire to possess the largest and most comprehensive library in the world, pursued an aggressive strategy to bring every conceivable scroll into their treasure chambers. They spared neither cost nor effort. Purchase, copying, and even the confiscation of valuable manuscripts became common practices in this restless pursuit of intellectual wealth. It was a veritably hunt for every single piece of evidence of human thought that existed anywhere in the world. A particularly fascinating aspect of this collecting mania was the so-called ship searches. Imagine how a merchant ship, after a long sea voyage, entered the busy harbor of Alexandria. No sooner had it dropped anchor than officials of the museum and the library stepped onto the deck. Their task was clearly defined. They searched the cargo for papyrus rolls, for every written work that the seafarers carried with them. If such treasures were found, they were immediately transferred to the library. There a meticulous process began. The scrolls were carefully copied, in some cases, especially with works of outstanding value or previously unknown importance. The librarians kept the original, and gave the owners back only the freshly made copy. This procedure, although it may seem questionable from today's perspective, demonstrates the unconditional will of the Ptolemies to make the library the indispensable center of all knowledge. The mere idea that every ship reaching their shores could potentially wash new knowledge into their collection must have electrified scholars and rulers alike. This unprecedented abundance of knowledge, gathered through such extraordinary methods, acted like a glowing magnet for the greatest thinkers of the ancient world. From all directions, scholars, philosophers, mathematicians, physicians, and poets flocked to Alexandria. They came, attracted by the vast quantity of writings that could be studied, discussed, and interpreted here. But it was not just the sheer mass of collected knowledge that drew them, it was also the generous royal support. The Ptolemies were not only collectors, but also patrons of the sciences. They offered scholars an inspiring environment, work opportunities, and the resources they needed for their research. This made the library a vibrant, living center of intellectual exchange, where old knowledge was preserved and new knowledge was continuously created. A central pillar of this intellectual golden age was the extensive translation work. In Alexandria, it was recognized early on how important it was to make knowledge accessible across language barriers. Works from Persia, Babylon, Egypt, and other cultures were translated into Greek, the lingua franca of the scholarly world at that time. A particularly outstanding example of this monumental achievement is the creation of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. This translation, which according to legend was produced by 70 or 72 Jewish scholars in Alexandria, was not only a philological masterpiece, but also had enormous cultural and religious impacts. It enabled the Greek-speaking world to gain access to the sacred scriptures of Judaism and significantly influenced later early Christian theology. The Library of Alexandria was no mere archive. It was a living organism that actively drew the knowledge of the world to itself, organized it, and thought it further. Chapter 4: The Golden Age of Discoveries. How does one measure the world in which one lives? Solely through the power of thought. How does one capture the seemingly infinite vastness of the heavens and organize it into an understandable system? These questions echoed through the colonnades and study rooms of the Library of Alexandria, and found answers in the minds of brilliant spirits who gathered here. In the quiet gardens adjacent to the great hall, one could often observe a man drawing geometric figures in the sand with a simple stick. Around him sat young students, captivated by his lines and explanations. This was Euclid, whose work The Elements would become one of the most influential books in human history. In 13 volumes, he gathered the entire geometric and arithmetic knowledge of his time, organized it systematically, and built it upon a handful of simple axioms. His work was so clear, so logical, and so comprehensive that it formed the undisputed foundation of mathematics for more than 2,000 years. In the silent concentration with which he drew a perfect circle in the sand lay the essence of the Alexandrian spirit. To create an elegant, eternal order out of the chaos of observations, this urge to order and understand the world led to one of the most astonishing achievements of antiquity. Eratosthenes, another scholar who headed the library, set himself a seemingly impossible task: measuring the globe. He had heard that in the city of Syene, far to the south, on a single day of the year, at the summer solstice, the sun stood directly at the zenith at noon, and cast no shadows. At the same time he noticed in Alexandria that a vertically placed rod did indeed cast a shadow. From the angle of this shadow, which was about 7.2 degrees, which corresponds to 1/50th of a full circle of 360 degrees, he concluded that the distance between the two cities must correspond exactly to 1/50th of the entire circumference of the earth. He hired beamatists, specially trained step counters, to determine the exact distance. With this data, the shadow angle, and pure logic, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth to a value that deviates from the value known today by an astonishing accuracy of only a few %. Solely through observation and intellect, a human being in the library had captured the true dimensions of our planet, yet the gaze of the scholars was directed not only at the earth, but also up to the stars. While most assumed an earth at the center of the universe, Aristarchus of Samos dared a revolutionary thought. He proposed that it was the sun that stood motionless at the center, and that the earth, together with the other planets, traveled in a circle around it. This heliocentric idea was so radical, so far ahead of its time, that it found few followers and was almost forgotten. But the scrolls containing his theory were carefully preserved and copied in Alexandria, a sleeping seed of knowledge that was to rise again almost 2,000 years later in the hands of Copernicus. Practical science also flourished. Although the brilliant inventor Archimedes of Syracuse did not live permanently in Alexandria, he was in close contact with the scholars there. His writings on the laws of levers, pulleys, and the screw named after him were eagerly studied, his methods analyzed and further developed. In the halls of the library, his genius was preserved and made accessible to posterity. At the same time, medical research advanced in groundbreaking ways. Herophilus of Chalcedon, a physician in Alexandria, dared to dissect human corpses to understand the structure of the body, an outrageous breach of taboo for that time. He was the first to distinguish between arteries and veins, and recognized the brain as the center of the nervous system. His detailed anatomical studies laid the foundation for scientific medicine. Meanwhile, in the observatories of the city, the astronomer Hipparchus mapped the starry sky with a precision previously unattained and created a catalogue of over 850 stars, determining their position and brightness. The library was thus far more than just a warehouse for books. It was a living organism, an engine of progress that promoted a culture of critical thinking, empirical research, and intrepid questioning. Every new thought, every discovery was discussed here, verified, and found its place in the grand mosaic of human knowledge, which grew day by day and painted an ever clearer picture of the world. Chapter 5 first cracks in the foundation. But while the light of knowledge in the halls of the museum shone brighter and clearer than ever before, dark clouds began to gather on Egypt's political horizon. For a library only thrives under stable conditions. Changing rulers, internal power struggles, and dwindling support left their marks. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had once begun with visionary founders, now produced rulers whose priorities had shifted from promoting the mind to pure, often brutal maintenance of power. The harmony between crown and academy, which had made the Golden Age possible, began to show fine cracks. A particularly grim figure in this development was Ptolemy VIII, mockingly called Physcon the Potbelly by the Alexandrians. His rule was characterized by intrigue, cruelty, and a deep mistrust of the intellectual elite, whom he saw as a threat to his autocratic control. The massive king sat enthroned surrounded by guards, not by scholars. His gaze was not one of curiosity or questioning, but one of vigilance and suspicion, one that stifled every free expression of opinion in its infancy. Decisions affecting the fate of the museum were now no longer made in the spirit of support, but as political chess moves. The library and its scholars became a pawn of power. The decisive blow came around the year 145 BC. In an act of political cleansing, Ptolemy VIII expelled a large part of the scholars and philosophers working in Alexandria. He accused them of conspiracy and disloyalty and forced them to leave the city. It must have been a sorry sight. A sad procession of men of the mind fleeing with few belongings and their most precious scrolls from the gates of the city that had once been their intellectual home and their sanctuary. Under a heavy gray sky they scattered to all winds, to Athens, to Rhodes, and to other cities of the Mediterranean. It was a bloodletting for Alexandria, an immeasurable loss of knowledge and talent, yet unintentionally, this despotic act also led to a new flowering. The expelled scholars carried the methods and knowledge of Alexandria into the world and founded new, smaller centers of learning elsewhere. Added to the political unrest were increasing financial difficulties. The maintenance of the vast complex of library, museum, laboratories, and gardens was immense. The salaries of the scholars, the costs for the copyists, the purchase and maintenance of thousands of papyrus rolls, all of this swallowed vast sums. But the revenues of the Ptolemaic Empire shrank through wars and mismanagement. The generous financing that was once taken for granted began to dry up. Budget cuts became noticeable. Perhaps the acquisition of new texts became rarer. Fewer young scholars were appointed, and gradually a thin layer of dust settled on instruments that were no longer used daily. The inexhaustible source from which the library had drawn for so long became a trickle. And while Egypt struggled with internal conflicts, a new, unstoppable power grew on the horizon: Rome. More and more often, ships with Roman sails entered the great harbor of Alexandria. At first they were envoys and traders, but soon they became legionaries and governors. Rome increasingly meddled in Egyptian politics, acting as an arbiter in dynastic disputes and gradually turning the once proud empire of the Ptolemies into a client state. Alexandria's intellectual autonomy dwindled along with its political one. The final turning point came after the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, when Egypt became a Roman province. The library was now no longer the radiant center of an independent Greek kingdom, but a jewel in the crown of a foreign empire with different interests. The walls of the library still stood, the scrolls still lay on their shelves, but the spirit that had once made them the pulsing heart of the world was deeply wounded, and the splendor of the Golden Age began to fade unstoppably. Chapter 6: Caesar's Flames, a disaster in battle. The unstoppable decline that was to seal the fate of the library did not have its origins solely in the cool administrative logic of Rome. Decades earlier, In a moment of military necessity and political turmoil, a spark was ignited that swelled into a devastating fire. The winds of fate that carried it came across the Mediterranean and brought one of the most dazzling and powerful figures of antiquity to the shores of Egypt. Gaius Julius Caesar. In the year 48 BC, he arrived in Alexandria, not as a scholar or admirer, but as a general and arbiter in a bitter war between siblings. The young, ambitious Cleopatra VII and her even younger brother Ptolemy XIII fought for the throne, and Caesar, who had pursued his own enemy Pompey as far as Egypt, found himself unexpectedly drawn into the whirlpool of this power struggle. Alexandria, the magnificent metropolis, became a trap. The royal Egyptian troops supporting Ptolemy far outnumbered Caesar and his few legions. The situation came to a head in the harbor, the pulsing heart of the city, where the Egyptian fleet blocked Caesar's ships and cut him off from any reinforcement. In the narrowness of the harbor basin, a desperate sea battle broke out. Roman discipline met the superior number of Egyptian galleys. The air was filled with the splintering of wood, the crash of colliding hulls, and the shouts of soldiers. In this besieged situation, Caesar resorted to a drastic and momentous measure. He ordered his men to set the enemy ships on fire. The fire was a terrible weapon. Dry wood, soaked in pitch and oil, caught flames greedily. In the shortest time, the harbor transformed into an inferno. Burning wrecks drifted on the water, and a massive column of black, acrid smoke rose into the clear sky over Alexandria. But the flames were not selective. Carried by an unpredictable sea breeze, the flames jumped from the ships to the wooden docks, and found plenty of fuel there. Warehouses, counting houses and shipyards, the economic backbone of the city, were engulfed by the firestorm within hours, and in these warehouses, some chroniclers report, was an inestimable treasure. Here begins one of the greatest debates of ancient historiography. What exactly burned on that fateful day? The Roman philosopher Seneca, writing about a century later, speaks of 40,000 scrolls that perished in the flames. A staggering number. The Greek historian Plutarch goes even further and mentions that the fire spread to the great library itself and damaged it. For centuries, these reports shaped the image of a catastrophic destruction, an intellectual fall from grace caused by the Roman war torch. Yet modern archaeological considerations paint a more nuanced picture. The Great Museum, the main complex of the library, was located in the Bruttium, the royal quarter which lay further inland. It is quite possible that the flames never reached this place. The 40,000 scrolls might have been in warehouses at the harbor. Perhaps they were newly arrived works waiting for transcription and cataloging, or books intended for export. An offshoot of the library, the Serapeum, was also located in a different part of the city and almost certainly remained unharmed. Whether it was part of the main collection or a vast storage site full of copies and new manuscripts, the loss was immense. Every single scroll was a window into the past, a source of knowledge, a work of art. The smoke drifting over Alexandria carried with it the ash of poems, scientific treatises, and historical records. The news of this fire must have hit the scholarly world like a shock. It was the first moment in which the invulnerability of this sacred place of knowledge was brutally called into question. That the damage was considerable is underscored by a later gesture of reparation. Years after the fire, when Mark Antony ruled the East at Cleopatra's side, he is said to have given her a gift of extraordinary generosity. To compensate for the losses, he turned over to her the entire library of Pergamon, one of the largest rival collections of the ancient world, with allegedly 200,000 scrolls. This act was more than just a token of love. It was an admission of the deep wound Caesar's flames had inflicted. Even if the walls of the museum perhaps still stood untouched, the fire in the harbor was an omen, a first painful proof of how quickly the collective memory of humanity could be extinguished by the turmoil of war and politics. Chapter 7: Fanaticism and Destruction. The end of the Serapeum. Which power is stronger? The silent power of the written thought or the fiery zeal of an unshakable faith? Centuries after Caesar's devastating fire in the harbor of Alexandria, this question was to be answered in a tragic way. The wounds Caesar's flames had inflicted were long since scarred, not least thanks to Antony's gift of the scrolls from Pergamon, and the daughter library in the magnificent Serapeum had grown into a new center of the remaining knowledge, but the world around it had fundamentally changed. A new faith, once whispered in secret and persecuted by the powerful, had risen from the catacombs and conquered the throne of the Roman Empire itself. Christianity, carried by a message of redemption and hope, had become the state religion. With the Edict of Thessalonica in the year 380 AD, issued by Emperor Theodosius I, this change was carved in stone. What was once one religion among many now claimed the sole truth for itself. This new certainty brought with it a growing intolerance toward everything considered pagan. The old gods were declared demons, their temples places of idolatry. Throughout the empire, people began closing the old cult sites, smashing the statues of gods, and banishing the symbols of centuries-old traditions from public life. The knowledge of the ancients, their philosophy, their science, their poetry, all of it was now under suspicion of being permeated by a false spirit. In this city of Alexandria, torn by deep spiritual conflicts, a man appeared on the scene whose name is inextricably linked with the fate of the Serapeum. Theophilus, the Patriarch of Alexandria. He was a man of unshakable faith and iron determination, a shepherd who wanted to protect his flock from the perceived dangerous influences of the old world. In his eyes, the Serapeum was more than just a library. It was a temple dedicated to the god Serapis, a syncretic deity once created by the Ptolemies to unite Greeks and Egyptians. For Theophilus, this place was the pulsing heart of paganism in his city, a symbol for everything that opposed his faith. In the year 391 AD, the situation came to a dramatic head. After clashes between Christians and pagans, Theophilus received permission from the emperor to take action against the pagan temples. He used this authority to make the Serapeum a place of confrontation. The atmosphere in the city was tense to the breaking point. An agitated Christian crowd, incited by sermons and the feeling of fulfilling a holy mission, gathered before the gates of the magnificent temple complex. Twilight descended over Alexandria, but the night was illuminated by the restless glow of hundreds of torches. Shouts and songs echoed through the streets, mixing into a choir of anger and religious ecstasy. The crowd surged forward, armed with tools, sticks, and the unconditional will to make a point. They stormed up the steps of the Serapeum, penetrating the courtyards and colonnades. What followed was not an act of targeted looting, but a storm of purification. Statues of philosophers and gods were pushed from their pedestals, shattering on the marble floor. Mosaics were trampled, inscriptions made unrecognizable, and then they reached the rooms of the library. The niches where tens of thousands of scrolls were once stored, the gathered knowledge of medicine, astronomy, poetry, and history, became the target of destruction. The papyrus rolls, as fragile as dried leaves, were torn out, shredded, and carelessly thrown to the ground. Some were perhaps used as fuel for the torches, their soft glow transforming into a final angry flare before turning to ash. It was the destruction of knowledge as an act of faith, a symbolic victory over a world one wanted to leave behind. In the empty niches where the voices of the greatest thinkers of antiquity once lived, there now reigned a dusty, final silence. The Serapeum had fallen, and with it, another vast piece of humanity's memory. Chapter 8. The myth of Caliph Omar. The dust that had settled on the ruins of the Serapeum had not yet come to rest when history took a new breath. More than 2 centuries passed, a span of time in which generations were born and passed away without ever knowing the true splendor of the old knowledge. Then, in the year 642 AD, a new power entered the city of Alexandria. Arab horsemen, led by the general Amr ibn al-As, rode under the golden sun of Egypt through the old avenues. With them came not only a new rule and a new faith, but also a legend that would prove to be as durable as the stone of the pyramids. It is a story that has been passed from mouth to mouth for centuries, an anecdote of captivating, terrifying logic. General Amru, it is told, was uncertain what should happen to the remaining scrolls, still to be found in the remnants of the libraries and warehouses of Alexandria. He sent a messenger to Caliph Omar in Medina to ask for his guidance. The caliph's answer, brought by the messenger, was of an absolute, unshakable clarity. As for the content of these books, Omar is said to have decreed, it can be only one of 2 things. Either it agrees with the Book of God, the Quran, then it is superfluous, or it contradicts the Quran, then it is harmful and must be destroyed. The command was unambiguous, and so, according to legend, the last fragments of the ancient spirit, the countless scrolls of papyrus and parchment, were collected. They were not simply burned, not committed to the fire in a single large pyre. Their end was practical, profane. The rolls were distributed to the more than 400 bathhouses of the city. For 6 months, it is said, the wisdom of Aristotle, the dramas of Sophocles, and the mathematical proofs of Euclid served as fuel to heat the water basins for the citizens of Alexandria. An unimaginable thought, the gathered knowledge of the world, transformed into warm steam and ash that settled over the roofs of the city. The voices of the greatest thinkers extinguished in the service of everyday convenience. But as vivid and haunting as this story is, its traces in the sands of history are fleeting. If we look closer, the clear image of the myth begins to flicker and dissolve. Modern historians largely agree that this narrative does not correspond to the facts. It is a legend that arose much later. The first written mention of this alleged instruction from Caliph Omar is found only in the 13th century by a Syrian scholar named Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi. That was almost 600 years after the Arab armies had invaded Egypt, 6 centuries in which no one had reported this dramatic command. By the time Amru ibn al-As reached Alexandria, the great library was already a phantom. The destructions of the preceding centuries had left only a shadow of its former greatness. There simply was no longer a vast collection of hundreds of thousands of scrolls that could have been burned. Why then did this legend arise, and why did it become so popular? The story served many purposes over time. For some, it was a welcome tool to attribute intolerance and hostility toward science to the early Islamic rulers. For others, it offered a simple, satisfying explanation for an incredibly complex loss. It is easier to point a finger at a single culprit, at a single fateful command, than to accept the slow, painful process of decay that had dragged on for centuries. The legend of Caliph Omar is perhaps the last, tragic chapter in the history of the library. A chapter that is not about destruction by fire, but about the power of narrative to fill the void left by the loss of knowledge. It became an echo in the empty halls, a story that says more about posterity's need for a scapegoat than about the actual events of that distant time. And so the myth itself remains a part of the library's legacy, a final fictional story that rose from the ashes of the real destruction. Chapter 9: What really was lost? What happens when an idea does not just fade, but its carrier, the papyrus roll, turns to ash? What remains of a thought when the ink that held it dissolves into smoke and is blown away by the desert wind? The destructions of the Library of Alexandria were more than just the loss of buildings and scrolls. They were an act of erasure, a deep hole torn into the collective memory of humanity. The true extent of this vacuum we can only guess today, like an astronomer looking into a dark void between the stars and knowing that something should be there, but can no longer see it. The range of lost knowledge is almost unimaginable. It was not just poems and epics that disappeared. It was the detailed records of generations of astronomers who had mapped the heavens over Babylon and Egypt. It was the writings of philosophers, whose schools of thought and arguments we only know from the quotes of their opponents. Distorted echoes in an intellectual desert. Entire treatises on mathematics, which perhaps contained alternative paths to calculus. Treatises on medicine based on centuries of observation, and detailed historical chronicles of civilizations whose names we do not even know today, are lost forever. Think of the lyric poet Sappho from the island of Lesbos. Of her once 9 books full of poetry, almost only fragments remain today, single lines or stanzas quoted by other authors and thus saved by chance over the centuries. We hold these tiny shards of a once massive mosaic in our hands and try to reconstruct the whole picture, but it remains an exercise of imagination. How many other geniuses of antiquity may have been completely blotted out from our history because not a single line of theirs survived? Their voices are forever silenced, their thoughts turned to dust in the ruins at the harbor of Alexandria. This gap is not just an academic curiosity. It raises a profound question about our own path. Would humanity have experienced a different, perhaps earlier Renaissance if the knowledge of antiquity could have been passed on seamlessly? The insights of Aristarchus of Samos about a heliocentric worldview or the precise calculations of the Earth's circumference by Eratosthenes were milestones, but they did not become a foundation upon which one immediately continued to build. Instead, they sank into the chaos of time, and later generations had to laboriously rediscover these findings. The destruction of the library was like felling a giant tree. Not only was the tree itself gone, but also the seeds it carried within for future forests. This break in the chain of knowledge contributed to deepening and prolonging the so-called Dark Ages. It was not a sudden onset of darkness, but rather the slow extinction of countless small flames of knowledge. Psychologically speaking, this loss feels like a phantom pain of civilization. We feel a void where once a rich treasure of thoughts and stories was stored. It is the gnawing feeling that an essential part of our common origin, our intellectual heritage, was irretrievably extinguished. The image of the empty halls where hundreds of thousands of rolls once lay creates a deep melancholy. It is a look into an abyss of transience, a reminder of how fragile the knowledge is that we take for granted. Not everything was lost, certainly. Some things survived in copies, in translations into Arabic and Latin, in the fragments preserved by scholars. But what we have are often only puzzle pieces. The big picture, the networked world of ancient thought in its entirety, remains unreachable for us. The library is not just a lost place, it is a lost world. And so the ghosts of these lost ideas still hover around us, a silent reminder of the infinite vastness of what we will never know. Chapter 10, The Echo of the Past. Is an idea ever really lost as long as the memory of it lives on? Even if the papyrus rolls turned to ash, and the halls of the ancient Library of Alexandria fell silent, its essence, the bold vision of a universal storehouse of knowledge, remained as an indelible echo in history. It became a powerful symbol, an ideal that inspired the human spirit across centuries. Every library founded since then, every archive that preserved manuscripts from decay, every university that promoted the free exchange of thoughts, unconsciously carries a spark of the fire that once blazed on the banks of the Nile. The idea was simply too big, too fundamental to be extinguished forever. It endured in the narratives, in the fragments that were saved, and above all, in the unquenchable human urge to understand, collect, and preserve. On that very coast where the ancient original once stood, a modern structure rises today that casts this echo into a tangible form. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, the new Library of Alexandria, is an homage of granite, glass, and steel. Its massive disc-shaped roof tilts toward the Mediterranean, like a rising sun that wants to radiate the light of knowledge back into the world. The outer curved wall is engraved with characters from all cultures and epochs of humanity, a silent commitment to the universality of the spirit that the founders of the ancient model valued so much. Opened in 2002, this building is more than just a storage place for books with a capacity for millions of volumes. It is a living cultural center, a place of research and dialogue that consciously attempts to bridge the gap between past and future. Inside, a vast terraced reading hall extends, supported by columns and bathed in light under the slanting glass roof. Here today sit students from all over the world, immersed in their laptops and books, continuing the work of the ancient scholars in their own way. The mission of the new library is not only to collect, but also to connect and create. It is a hub in a global network dedicated to digitization and the protection of the written heritage. Yet the existence of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina is not only a sign of hope, but also a constant reminder carved in stone. Its mere sight reminds us of the immense fragility of knowledge. What was once considered indestructible could be destroyed by a chain of human failure, by indifference, conflict, and blind fanaticism. The downfall of the ancient library teaches us a bitter lesson. Cultural goods are not self-evident possessions. They require active protection, constant care, and the unconditional will of a society to preserve them. The fire that Caesar's ships set, the dogmatic rage that destroyed the Serapeum, and the slow erosion through neglect, all these are warning signals that echo across the millennia. They warn us of the danger that arises when ideologies are placed above open dialogue, and when the fear of the stranger defeats curiosity. In our today's digitally networked world, access to information seems limitless. With a few clicks, we can access databases, articles, and books from all over the world. But it is precisely this abundance that makes the lessons from Alexandria all the more relevant. The intellectual freedom that once flourished in the museum is not a given today either. It must be defended against censorship, disinformation, and the tendency to close oneself off in echo chambers of one's own belief. Open access to knowledge is the foundation of an enlightened society. It enables criticism, promotes innovation, and is the strongest means against the tyranny of dogma. The history of the Library of Alexandria is thus not only a tale of burned papyrus and lost texts, it is an ongoing reflection on our own handling of knowledge, on our responsibility to protect it, share it, and increase it for coming generations. The soft flickering of a candle in a dark room can provide more light than a blazing inferno. The eternal light of knowledge burns on, gentle and persistent, a silent flame waiting to be discovered and carried further by curious minds, while the great wheel of time turns incessantly. Outro, our common journey through the corridors of time now finds its gentle end. We have witnessed the golden era of Alexandria, stood in awe before the construction of its unique library, and followed the traces of those great scholars whose thoughts changed the world. But we also saw how the shadows of decline slowly settled over this radiant center of knowledge and eventually let it sink into the darkness of history. The story of the Library of Alexandria, however, is more than just a distant tale of marble, papyrus, and ruins. It is a quiet parable about the fragility of human heritage, and a reminder that alerts us to the constant danger posed by ignorance and intolerance. It teaches us the invaluable preciousness of every single thought preserved from oblivion, and how important it is to keep the flame of curiosity alive. Every spark of understanding passed on is a victory over transience. May the silent halls of the former library, through which we walked in our imagination, and the soft imagined rustle of its lost papyrus rolls, now accompany you into a deep, restful sleep. Imagine how the scholars of times past were immersed in their writings, surrounded by the silence of the night, and find in this image your own well-deserved peace. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the silent beauty of the knowledge that waits for you in the depths of history. That was today's night lesson. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Good night and sleep well.